What are we doing now exactly? Because because I have different briefings now. You said like I should talk 45 minutes. Igor said everyone will be dead, including me, if I talk 45 minutes. You said I should talk 20 minutes.
I think that we have I think that we might have one question. What is speculative realism for you? What does it mean for you, speculative realism? Because we've seen lots of points of view, but they are not, there is no one point.
Yeah, but this is not a film about speculative realism, you know? It's a film about the hyperstition, and the question is whether speculative realism is a hyperstition, you know?
Yeah.
So
and whether it
I
is.
reply slowly because I hear the translator. Try to get him finished. So, I mean, there are different ways of approaching your question. Speculative realism is a philosophical movement, right? So, as every philosophical movement, it can be something very boring, like it can be some doctrine, you know, some orthodoxy, or it can be something exciting, like a movement in the sense of like moving and changing. So for me, the part that is exciting about it is that it is in transformation and it changes, you know, and it formulates a kind of basic paradoxy that was also mentioned in the film, namely between the two terms, you know, speculative and realism, because in our like philosophical culture, or like in philosophical modernity, or like in philosophy since Kant, since 1800, we got used to like seeing these two things as opposite. Either you speculate, you know, like Kant wrote like 3 critiques with one main goal, namely to purify reason and to avoid that reason does what it naturally does without control, namely speculating, losing ground and becoming unscientific. So critiques are done, or our critical legacy is to not speculate. And not to become unrealistic, not to lose touch with reality. So speculative realism obviously has a different claim, and if you look into the history, maybe I should say something about these two terms. I said something about speculating. Now, if you look at realism, you know, realism initially is a term from literary theory, or like a 19th century art history, where I don't know, you think of Courbet, or think of Balzac, or think of Flaubert, and so on. There you have something very natural, namely the real is part of reality. So these realist writers, they just like went, for example, in France, they went to the dark corners of the working class and showed the reality that hasn't been shown before by romantic writers or idealistic writers. So you have a kind of, historically, you have a kind of really natural going together of the real and reality. In the whole 20th century, the whole revolutionary, avant-gardistic, formalistic, modernist 20th century is, one could say, at first sight, kind of anti-realistic, you know? Like, I mentioned the political or the artistic endeavors. They were all like, we gotta break through reality, you know? The real is like behind the surface that we see, you know? We gotta like start painting an abstraction. We gotta make a revolution in order to have a real life, and so on. So the whole formalistic and avant-gardistic endeavor of the 20th century is against this representative, mimetic, so to say, realism of the 21st century. And nevertheless, you know, so for the long story, but like trying to get to the 21st century, no one else than Alain Badiou wrote a book about the siècle, the century, where he defines the 20th century as for its passion du réel, for its passion for the real. And I would say the whole apparently formalistic 20th century is very realistic. It's just a different understanding of what the real is, you know? There's a traumatic realism, or the real is seen as something that is like dangerous and too hard understand, or it would overwhelm us. So we need a kind of symbolic filter in order to not be killed by it, you know. So the real, in the sense of Jacques Lacan, the real is something that we cannot grasp. So this isn't, I mean, it's very rough what I'm doing here, but like this 19th and 20th century like realism, I think they are no longer like our 21st century understanding of what reality is and what realism is. So the speculative realism, now finally come to the 21st century, is one where it's really the task to understand reality, and there's a claim in speculative realism that we can actually understand reality, but we can only do it via philosophical speculation, by integrating the latest advanced science that we have, by thinking about technology and so on. So compared with the whole kind of post-structuralist or Frankfurt School critical, even partly like Marxist tradition that understands reason as instrumental reason, as negative, as alienating and so on, speculative realism is a claim for, it's a kind of argument in favor of rationality and understanding in a way. So that's why we did the summer school on emancipation and navigation. Yeah, so it's a long answer. I mean, the question is really like, we can discuss like Hume and Kant in detail, or we can, you know, there's so many things to talk now. I really do have different like briefings. I mean, I can talk a bit about, or what I prepared. I can tell you what I prepared, and then we'll roll and you tell me what you want to hear. A bit about like speculatism, but mainly from the backdrop of post-structuralism, to show a bit like how this philosophy distinguishes. Then there is a section on accelerationism. Then there is one part on speculatism and contemporary art, which I think is a big misunderstanding. I mean, there is, which is partly also what we try to show in the film, where you see that the curators and the artists are kind of confused. They don't know what to do with the speculative realism, and I think there are good reasons for it. So these are the 3 or 4 parts that I could talk about, but what I actually would like most of all is that like we enter a kind of conversation, and as you see, I talk far too much anyhow, so
Maybe we can start with some questions and then...
And I promise to reply like quickly, within like 1.5 minutes.
So давайте тогда мы перейдем к вопросам, а потом перейдем к основной части про
спекулятивный. It's not laziness,
про спекулятивный реализм и современное искусство. Есть ли вопросы?
Здравствуйте. Большое спасибо за переводчику, наверное, за то, что он сделал. Это было, наверное, непросто. Но один из последних тезисов, который был высказан в фильме, это тезис о том, как мы можем изменить будущее. И мне хотелось бы услышать какой-то тезис от вас о том, как мы можем изменить будущее. И о том, как вы его видите просто. Мне кажется, это один из главных тезисов, который переосмысливает прежний манифест акселерационизма. Вот. И хотелось бы услышать от вас какой-то небольшой устный эссе. Спасибо.
Yeah. So I guess the question is, how can one change the future? Right? Yeah. No, but I try to bring this. Okay. Changing the future. I mean, we have this like theory and practice here. That's. So I think you asking me as a theoretician. How can we change the future? Thinking about HYPERSTITION and thinking about the film, which is a philosophical film and which is not just a theory film, but it's like philosophy put into practice, because what we wanted to show is like how thinking works, you know, like how people really like think. They're very different characters, you know, like often we've thought it's not so interesting what they say, but how they're trying to come up with their thoughts or so. So that's one topic is thinking in the film, but the other one is of course time in the future, and I think we cannot think about the future without thinking about time, and but you asking me as a theoretician, my answer is a bit here, you know, to turn it around and say like, how do we think about time? And how do we think about the future? And don't we have to understand that the future is actually changing the present? That we live in a kind of, what you could call a derivative or paradigm or derivative condition. The way prices are decided in the stock market, our whole economy, but I think also our general way of thinking, our culture is governed by the future. So I would change the question. All I can do is like do theory, you know, and do philosophical tricks maybe. But so it's not about maybe in the 21st century we have to, or maybe one of the lessons from speculative realism is to stop asking how we change the future, but how we project ourselves into the future in order to think differently about our present. Because this example that I briefly mentioned in the film, when Meyer Su talks about the archifossil, you know, it's a very weird like thought experiment. Maybe does everybody know it, or shall I repeat it? Or so this whole kind of starting point of speculative realism is this little thought experiment, one could say, by Meyer Su, namely that he says that there are certain archifossils that are like billions of years old. And how do we think them as philosophers? Like, how can we think something that is so old that it's older than everything that we can imagine, and that this object, this fossil, is not just like 2,000 years old, but it has existed in a time where there was nothing else that was able to perceive it, to think it, to smell it, to taste it, to touch it, or whatever. So for him, you know, that's the beginning of his philosophy, that this is an object, he calls it an archifossil, you know, that is in its own time. It's not in human time. We cannot like go backwards, like yesterday, 2 days ago, 1 year ago, 100 years ago, 2 million years ago. You know, we can only like project ourselves back, but we can never think this object in its own time, what he calls not a human time, but an ancestral time. So what I find interesting in Meyer Su is a reversal of time, what I call a speculative temporality, is exactly to not think in chronology and not think how can we change the future, but like how can we think from the future backwards about the past, which is our present, you know. Another variation of this change of temporality is what Ray Brassier is doing. He says in order to get away from a correlationist philosophy. So correlationism is according to Meyer Su philosophy that can only think an object in relation to a subject thinking it, to someone thinking it, and for some of the, or for most of the speculative realists, the philosophical task is really to think objects independent of them being thought, of them being imagined or perceived. So for Meyer Su, he goes back into the past and starts like this investigation or these thought experiments about the archifossil, to develop something like a non-correlationist philosophy. That means a philosophy that is not always correlating the object to a subject. And Brassier goes the other way, and he says like, no, if you want to break with correlationism, we shouldn't go back to the past, to the archifossil, we got to look into the future, and like his very radical nihilistic philosophy is to say, we're all dead. We know for a fact from physics, that the sun will explode. We will no longer be here. It's not that we'll be dead and our children won't remember us, and this recording, if there's any recording that's done, will disappear. But every kind of atomic kind of existence of we've been in touch with will have disappeared. So the sun has exploded, It's not the sun will explode, but what do we do with the fact, if we really think it in a radical way, the sun has already exploded. We know it, and we know that everything will disappear. So there are two ways of seeing that, this attempt for non-correlationist philosophy. Either is to say it's very nihilistic, it's apolitical, it's destructive, it's utter despair, we don't know what to do, or it triggers a kind of new emancipatory and very liberating political project, namely it opens up the complete contingency of the present. So once we see that we're governed from the future, that we are structured from the future, looking back into the past, which is our present, is completely open. So every moment is contingent and something can be done. So one of the thinkers that's relevant here is this Elia Yash that we saw, who's working a lot on finance and explaining that in terms of derivatives and financial practices. And then, of course, the whole accelerationism, but that's yet another topic.
Я вот хотел немного пояснить, чем занимается сам Армен в этом контексте. Дело в том, что его критика спекулятивного реализма в таком уже в общем восприятии, в рецепции, которая началась уже в последние годы, связана с тем, что он, собственно говоря, указывает на односторонность подходов критики, например, акселерационизма, связанных с неучетом лингвистического поворота, например, в начале прошлого века, с отсутствием такой медиа-аналитики, например, то есть учета медиальности языка и вообще природы языка, которая не сводится вовсе к какому-то субъектному произволу или вообще не является творчеством некоего субъекта, да? То есть вот указать в самом языке, в самом творческом производстве языка такой момент, который связывает язык с реальностью. То есть, в общем, не противопоставляется реальности, как вот какой-то рассказ всегда уже как мифологии или в Библии рассказанный, которому мы должны теперь просто следовать, а предложить целая множественность, целая огромная вариативность этих рассказов, этих нарративов и столкнуть их друг с другом для того, чтобы вот это будущее стало снова возможным. Я хотел бы одну из идей Армена просто пояснить на примере, связанном с русской культурой, с русским футуризмом, с этой темой времени в искусстве. Армен в своей книге о спекулятивных зарисовках, написанной в соавторстве с художником Андреасом Топфером. Вот эта книга «Спекулятивные зарисовки» или «Спекулятивные рисунки», которая будет скоро издана в России, в Москве. Она посвящена такой интересной теме, как совместить искусство, то есть не то чтобы искусство уже состоявшееся, а такую практику художника, действующего своими средствами, и рефлексию, спекулятивную работу, которая исходит от Армена и его друзей. Как сделать так, чтобы вырваться из этой ложной связи, порочной связи между искусством и философией, когда философия только что-то в искусстве объясняет, что-то там интерпретирует, а искусство, в свою очередь, только иллюстрирует какие-то философские идеи. И чтобы эта работа была в таком странном новом понимании времени, и даже лучше сказать, в новом времени происходило, когда художник и теоретик работают над какой-то общей проблематикой своими средствами, и эффекты от их встречи непредсказуемы. То есть они порождают это новое, в обход вот этой безнадежности уже готовых всех завершенных проектов в искусстве, в политике, и в философии. Вот этот оптимизм, который связан со спекулятивным проектом вообще, который может иногда смущать, может иногда вызывать какую-то критику, он связан просто с чем-то, что на самом деле является нашим повседневным опытом, и что в истории, например, искусства русского, о котором я уже сказал, было достигнуто, например, в 10-е и 20-е годы прошлого века, когда русские футуристы как бы опередили время, можно сказать, когда они забежали в будущее, как бы оккупировали его и невольно отбросили настоящее куда-то далеко в прошлое. И получилось так, что на сегодняшний день, обращаясь к этому архиву, к этим возможностям, мы видим это будущее в прошлом, и оно не дает состояться новому. И, в принципе, если понимать футуризм и авангард русский как что-то, что вот размещено навсегда в каком-то топосе временном, неважно, кстати, в прошлом или в будущем, и вообще не делать никаких попыток, да, понять сам код, как бы саму программу этого проекта, то никогда этому проекту вообще как бы не удастся в этом настоящем сбыться. Вот, и, по-моему, вот Армен как бы пытается как раз эту проблему в своих конкретных опытах решить.
Thanks. There were many questions now. I will focus first of all on what I understood as the first part of the question, namely my criticism of realism, or my view on realism, and what you said about linguistic turn and analytical philosophy and language. Because as I said, I'm always listening to two sides, no? Because when two people invite you gotta please both of them. That I should say a bit more about the linguistic turn and speculative realism and so on. So maybe again I try to locate it like historically, you know, when this conference 2007 happened of speculative realism. First of all, the title just came by accident. You know, there was a poster and you need a title for a poster, and then someone said speculative, I don't know what, metaphysics, and I was like, no, not with me, no metaphysics. The next one said naturalism, no, not naturalism. So as a compromise, it was like speculative realism, you know, like it was not like as a program initially. But the one thing that they all these philosophers like shared, was this kind of non-correlationism, or this idea that one should get rid of correlationism, and a kind of being fed up with the way philosophy academically was done in the decades before, you know. So you got to understand, like 2007, it was a conference at Goldsmiths in London, and Goldsmiths is an art academy or so that has not even got a philosophy department, you know. So the philosophical situation in the Anglo-Saxon world, and also more and more in Germany, like we have to talk about it, maybe like how it is here in Russia, is in the Anglo-Saxon world, 90% of philosophy is analytical philosophy. Yeah, that's logic, that's philosophy of language, and so on. And the philosophy, the continental philosophy, like French philosophy, Italian philosophy, and so on, is done in humanities. That's like Deleuze, post-structuralism, and so on. So, but after a few decades of like post-structuralism, this became a kind of jargon, and it became a kind of academic, feel-good kind of theory that was just circling in itself without any kind of impact on culture, or that didn't really gain traction in any kind of political debate. So the idea was that in 2007, or when I lived in London, was that we need a different, not just philosophical theory, but also a different philosophical practice, a less academic philosophy, and a philosophy that gets beyond post-structuralism. Because the way post-structuralism was seen was that it was in the heritage of the so-called linguistic turn. And linguistic turn is like, dating back at the beginning of the 21st century, it is somehow the initial kind of like trigger of a whole philosophical or theoretical or cultural, I would even say, paradigm that turned out to be very skeptical. The danger of like skepticism and relativism and so on, that everything is just a product of language, everything is just a product of ideology, everything is just a result of the way we think about it. So here you hear the correlationist aspect. So in a certain sense, post-structuralism is just one variation or so of correlationism, of a correlationist philosophy, and speculative realism had this kind of like idea or wanted to overcome the linguistic turn with something like a speculative turn. Now, me personally, and now I come to your question, I'm skeptical about this like easy kind of oppositions, you know, relativist, deconstructive, post-structuralist philosophy, focusing on language on the one hand, and real ontology, materialistic philosophy on the other hand. So my project that I started with Anke Hennig, that some of you might know, of speculative poetics, is exactly to overcome this kind of empty opposition of either you do philosophy of language or you do a materialistic philosophy. And I think, especially like in the Russian like philosophical tradition, where there's Russian formalism, but also like a writer that we translated and that's really important for us, like Valery Podoroga with this idea of a poetic ontology. You know, so there are thinkers that do think further than this first, like very juvenile, one could say, 2007 enthusiasm of speculative realists, saying that we make everything new and we do proper philosophy again, and we want to really touch reality. You know, we want to think about the things in themselves, thing in itself. Das Ding an sich, as Kant called it. That means everything that the correlationist philosophy of post-structuralism said that we are not able to. So I hope that made it a bit clear. And so what I did in order to overcome it was really like starting. So part of like speculative poetics is again like theory in practice. So what I did is like I started translating a lot. I invited all these speculative philosophers, for example, and wanted them to rethink their a bit superficial ideas about language, or this opposition of language or ontology, and I must say that I was somehow successful. So one of the next papers that we will that I'll publish is a kind of 110-pager that is so complicated that even after 7 times reading it, I still haven't understood it, by Meyer Su, which is a theory of le signe dépourvu du sens, the meaningless sign. So where Meyer Su comes up with a new version of his philosophy, where it says like the reason why we can explain reality, why science can touch upon the real, is exactly because it uses science. You know, so it comes up like with a different reading of the Persian semiotics and a reading of what he calls meaningless science. So because science uses meaningless science, it is capable, like mathematics or also physics, it is able to understand reality. Now again, in this volume, I write a text where I criticize again Meyer Su for thinking that only mathematical science can do it and so on. But like, the point is really philosophy is, if you're crazy enough, philosophy is something exciting, you know, and it's in the making, you know. There is no speculative realism, it is what we make out of it, you know. It happened 8 years ago now. You know, what's 8 years? It's laughable, you know? I mean, philosophy, you gotta think in like decades or hundreds of years. So I think what's important about, that's why I'm always like, that's why I also made the film, but that's why I'm also skeptical about like explaining this is speculative realism, because there are 4 thinkers that partly don't even talk to each other anymore. and they disagree to what they said like 5 years ago. So there is no point of making it yet again a boring chapter in the history of philosophy. That's academic philosophy, and I'm less interested in that. I'm interested in producing platforms where philosophy happens, where these crazy people talk like partly crazy things. So sorry, that wasn't scientific enough. But there's a futurist element also in philosophical practice. You gotta create platforms where something happens, and then things develop, and you don't know beforehand what comes out of it. That's also an element of speculative realism as a practice. You don't, you invent the future, and then you see where it drags you. So it's a kind of maybe not post-humanist, but an inhuman philosophy. It's an anti-humanist philosophy in every sense. There is nothing human that we all share, that binds us, that lies in the past, But there is if there is something that pushes us further, it's our reason, that never lets us stop, that pushes us further, that drags us into the future. So the drag, or the kind of how do you say this? There's a kind of sucking from the future that makes it impossible that we remain these old, boring humans, or so we hope. Sorry, this is not a long answer.
Я на самом деле свою функцию вижу в том, что кто хочет высказаться, возможно, не обязательно вопрос. У нас на самом деле не все так печально в нашей стране и в Москве с этим направлением, скажем так, еще не состоявшимся. Потому что у нас есть люди, кто занимается этим непосредственно проектом, как-то его критикует, преломляет к нашей ситуации. Ну и занимается большой переводческой работой. Я кстати, должен сказать, пользуясь случаем, что книгу, которую мы издали в РКГУ издательстве уже 2 года назад, «Поэтика настоящего времени» Армена Аванесяна и его коллеги Анки Хеннинга, которую он уже упоминал, была переведена Борисом Скуратовым, не знаю, он еще здесь или нет, но это очень был сложный проект, в котором участвовала еще Лин Ханова, наша коллега из Московского университета, философского факультета. И сейчас мы тоже собираемся вслед за этим активизмом Армена издать в журнале «Логос», собственно, первые тексты акселерационистского направления или части этого общего спекулятивного проекта, который вышел благодаря усилиям Армена в Германии несколько лет назад. И, собственно, здесь присутствуют переводчики, авторы тоже этого журнала. Может быть, кто-то хочет что-то сказать? Пожалуйста.
Вопрос.
Да, давайте.
Да, здравствуйте. Я когда смотрел ваше видео, все смотрели, мне кажется, для меня было очевидно, что ваш проект философский имеет очевидные политические импликации. И я хотел в этом смысле спросить, как вы сами осмысляете отношение вашего нового философского проекта к политике, и, может быть, с какими авторами или политическими проектами прошлого вы себя соотносите? Потому что, мне кажется, по крайней мере, то, что я слышал, вы много говорили о чистом изменении, трансформации, времени, и мне это, по крайней мере, единственное, к чему это отсылает, по крайней мере, в моей памяти, это во многом Рансьер и, может быть, Кастриадис, которые также мыслили возможности чистого прерывания, чистой креативности, при этом не предлагая какого-то конкретной политической программы. И мне кажется, спекулятивный реализм, ваша философия, также и политична в том отношении, что работает с трансформацией как таковой, не предлагая некую позитивную программу. Мне хотелось спросить, мыслите ли вы политическое как нечто имманентное в вашей философии, или вы же предполагаете некоторую все-таки картину, некоторую все-таки политическую картину будущего? Да. Спасибо.
Спасибо за вопрос.
Yeah, thanks for the question, but there's one thing, because I didn't read my paper, I completely forgot to say thanks, really, to both two of you, but also to the two Sashas. the amazing translation of the film. I think it was. I mean, I didn't understand the translation, but from the email conversation. Sasha Won made an amazing job, and the questions that I hear now also. So thanks to the translators. Otherwise, I forget. So the question of the political implications, you know, two answers. I mean, one is that theory already is a practice and therefore is political. So the question how we do philosophy, you know, is for me already a political one. So who are the philosophers that are like translated? Who are the philosophers that are heard? Who are the philosophers that are written about in the newspapers? Who are the philosophers that are printed and so on? We are used, you know, and that goes together with what I said before. In the last 3 or 4 decades, there was a certain pattern. And the pattern went.
One moment. We can continue. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to give a twofold reply. One is about like theory in itself being political, and the other one is like political theory. So I was just about to say that for me it's important that we understand also theory as the way theory is done as something political. In the last decades, and with post-structuralism, and the role post-structuralism also had within academia and the art world, there's a certain pattern that we all know. And the pattern goes, I exaggerate a bit, is the following. There's an 80-year-old French philosopher from Paris, yeah, that becomes trendy in the art world, yeah. Then he gets translated, and then he goes into, like, slowly he's recognized also in academia. So you have that, like, Deleuze, then you have Foucault, then you have Lyotard, then you have Badiou, then you have Rancière. So it's always this kind of, it's got to be a French philosopher who's a famous philosophy teacher in Paris and who's 80 years old, you know, and that's already in itself, you know, and all of them come out of like 68. So there's a certain idea about how politics works. That means we go to the street and we all like become a kind of organic collective and so on, and provoke a kind of reaction in politics. And I think I come from a different generation, and without this fantasy or phantasma of 68 in a kind of direct, like you called it, interruption, you know, like this interruptive kind of the empty event of Badiou or so on, you know, this kind of fantasy politics, or this kind of Maoist fantasies. But this already leads me to the second part. But I hope the first part becomes clear. I work, or I try to understand my. That's why I said like I'm a publishing activist. You know, this book like accelerationism. You know, like 18 months ago, no one heard about accelerationism, and now people think it's something really serious. You know, and then people come and say like, well, this is just a hype, it will go away. And I say like, well, what's a hype? We're in the 21st century. What does hype mean? You know, maybe it's a hyperstition. You know, so maybe speculative realism or accelerationism or hyperstitionism are all like hyperstitions. But we have to learn to think differently about like what the politics of theory is in a way. And for me it's important that a different generation of philosophers, as you've seen, they're all like pretty young, that they are taken serious and they are translated and they are like discussed, and not just like this 70 or 80-year-old French post-structuralist philosophers. So that was the first part of the question. The politics of theory, and then this also translates into what kind of like political theory I'm interested in. And this accelerationist philosophy is one that always works with the invention of platforms, or manipulating the platforms that are available manipulate them and change them and produce something new out of them. And I think you mentioned two very important words. Like one was creativity and interruption. Was it right? Creativity interruption. So one element that Ray Brassier mentioned at towards the end of his talk, saying like against the current changes and procedures in capitalism, it just simply doesn't help marching on the street or handing out leaflets. The most discussed issues now in where I come from in Berlin is climate change, or the NSA, global surveillance and so on. These, so the enemy is that far ahead of us technologically that we cannot respond to it, and we cannot fight against it with our good old 68 kind of measures, handing out leaflets, protesting, occupying, having sit-ins and so on. It simply doesn't work. So what we have to do is overcome what accelerationism calls the analphabetism in terms of technology of the left. We, all of us, we are completely ignorant in terms of maybe one or two are different here, but Igor, the two of us, we are relatively ignorant in terms of technology and science, So we complain about many things, but we simply don't know how to fight the fights that need to be fought. So by simple interruption and disturbance or criticism, nothing will change, because the capitalism we live in just works via is in a constant mode of crisis. It works via crisis and criticism. It incorporates it in a way. So that's why in accelerationism it became important for us to really focus and analyze, or even find new research topics in a way. For example, some of them were mentioned here, automation, and what that maybe in the future we only have to work 2 or 3 hours, Then biohypermedia, the connection between technology and the body, virtual money, the social medias, why do we all, for example, use Facebook, and all it does is not create a better society or a new common in a way, but increases the stock market price for a company somewhere in Palo Alto and so on. So what are really the focus points, and what do we have to focus on for kind of contemporary or 21st century politics? That's a question of accelerationism, but the basic intuition is that we do not need to destroy and interrupt capitalism in any kind of abstract Maoist way, but we got to use the progressive tendencies and navigate them. But the only way to navigate them is to get ahead of ourselves and accept the kind of acceleration we simply live in, and we can only do it by overcoming our ignorance in terms of science and technology. Only then we can use these technologies and navigate them in an emancipatory way. So that's if there's one intuition of accelerationism, that's the one. And I think it's also, yet again, a generational difference compared to this radical break, again, Maoist, empty event, I don't know what fantasies,
And what is the role of art, of contemporary art in it? In this system of speculative realism, accelerationism, and so on?
Well, I mean, the history of it's a tricky question, because speculative realism only gained traction or only became popular via the contemporary art world. It is, yeah. It only became somehow popular. I'm here in a kind of, because there's somehow money in the contemporary art world and not in Russian philosophy academia, right? I mean, that is just, as a matter of fact, 50% of the speculative realists are either unemployed, or they're sitting in Cairo, or they sit in Beirut, in Lebanon, and so on, or they are like half unemployed as I am, and so on. So we live in a very different context, and we have to deal with the evil, which is the contemporary art world, right? So we have to live with that means the contemporary art market, where the money is, if we want to survive in theory. So the history of how speculative realism has been adopted and understood or misunderstood is in itself very intriguing, because as you see here in the film, you saw there were certain philosophers. There's Meyer Su, there's this new rationalism, there's Ian Hamilton Grant, and there's Ray Brassier. But the philosophy, or the one philosopher that has been very easily and very quickly accepted by the contemporary art world was another one, who's Graham Harman, who argues very differently, and he developed something like an object-oriented philosophy that I find interesting and so on, but it's not my cup of tea, and it's not the kind of philosophy I feature. But I think it's symptomatic why Graham Harman was so became so fashionable, because he's once again, I think for several reasons. One is that he was understandable within the philosophical paradigm that was already known. So he's arguing via phenomenology. He is he wrote several books on Bruno Latour. He's into the kind of flattening of ontological separation between the human and objects and so on. And you can see it the way I prepared a passage on shall I talk a bit about the documenta, the last documenta, where speculative realism became really popular for the first time?
Yeah.
So I do a bit. On the other hand, it's 10 o'clock. I'm supposed to finish in 2 minutes. I won't do it, but it's interesting that the kind of philosophy that the kind of speculative realism I'm interested in, and the one that I'm trying to feature, is more radical, accelerationist, pro-enlightenment, rationalistic, new rationalist. Speculative realism has not at all been incorporated by the art world yet, because in my understanding it is a big provocation to the way contemporary art works, because contemporary art is fully relying on aesthetics as a kind of critical and philosophical practice. And for me, aesthetics really is the hypercorrelationist theory that one can imagine. Aesthetics is always based on a certain understanding of aesthetic experience. That means I see a film, I see an object, I see a painting, but the painting only becomes a proper artwork by me observing it, The aesthetic experience is something happening between me and the artwork. So it's always this correlation between the two things, between the subject and the object. And I think taking speculative realism seriously would imply a radical rethinking of contemporary art, or would mean something that would have been the third part of my amazing talk that I will give next time I come to Moscow, promised, would be to, is relying very much on the theories of a friend and colleague of mine, Suhail Malik, who wrote a very interesting piece that you can find online as well, Reason to Destroy Contemporary Art. So it's reason, of course, coming from this rationalist philosophy, but for him, speculative realism is a reason to finish contemporary art, and we need a different kind of paradigm of producing art, which would have been the fourth part of my amazing talk. Some art projects that I'm working on, currently. But to answer really quickly, I think it's a big misunderstanding so far. But on the other hand, I welcome the possibilities of contemporary art, because philosophy today really happens to a large degree, or the interest in philosophy happens within contemporary art and not in philosophical seminars. Maybe it's different in Russia, but at least in Berlin.
Спасибо, Армен. Я хотел сказать все-таки несколько слов о нашей ситуации, чтобы тебе тоже было интересно. В принципе, у нас нет такого совсем неприятия этой критики и акселерационизма, и спекулятивного реализма в отношении таких больших, крупных институций, как философия или современное искусство. есть как бы движения, которые, в принципе, вполне соответствуют и созвучны усилиям твоих друзей и твоих собственных. Я только могу указать, например, еще на более ранний постконцептуалистский проект в русском искусстве 70-х до 2000-х годов, который, в принципе, предполагал уход от эстетизма, от рассмотрения искусства только в рамках какого-то эстезиса, только как бы какого-то восприятия художественного или самовыражения личности. Основной тезис был связан там с тем, чтобы превратить сам текст в вид как бы иконы или в вид какого-то образа, да, который мог бы считываться именно не как текст философский, а как именно некоторый перевод как бы текста на язык визуальности. И наоборот. То есть, в принципе, эти опыты, они как бы известны, и другое дело, что они не получили поддержки уже в современной как бы России, которая сейчас испытывает такую жажду обретения искусством рыночной формы. И это немножко забивает как бы поиски иногда даже талантливых художников. Вот. Но это, в принципе, для нас такие общие места. Я хотел бы сказать вам несколько слов еще о такой позиции Армена в отношении политичности его проекта. Вот в книге, о которой мы уже говорили, книге сборники статей по акселерационизму, его текст, посвященный кризису, критике и акселерационизму, я вот как раз переводил, и там есть очень интересная мысль, связанная с тем, что критика, ну, в таком вот понимании ее франкфуртской школы, да, нескольких поколений франкфуртской школы, исключая Бенемина, она превратилась в нечто поддерживающее кризис, как такой общий нарративный такой как бы дискурс неолиберальной как бы вот такой философии, которая всегда говорит про кризис и, ссылаясь на кризис, да, ищет пути выхода из него, как бы сегментируя как бы какой-то вот кризисный фрагмент реальности, там, связанный там с какими-то, допустим, инвестициями в жилье, там какие-то кризисы, связанные, допустим, там, с фондовым рынком, с какими-то национальными проблемами, с нефтью, газом и так далее. Она его как бы секвестирует, так распределяет, каким-то образом добивается еще более сильной прекаризации как бы трудящихся, то есть людей, которые работают в этих сферах кризисных. И таким образом как бы обменяет будущее, да, то есть она всегда проецирует некоторую ситуацию настоящего, такого вот холостого хода неолиберального капитализма на будущее, считая, что в будущем ничего не может произойти для самого как бы, вот, капитализма. Поэтому, когда вот Армен говорил, повторяя как бы тезисы России, например, и других вот таких правых, что ли, акселерационистов, тут надо учесть, что левое критикуется сейчас не из-за того, что оно левое, и что, да, оно критикуется потому, что левый дискурс встроился как бы в капитализм в качестве его самооправдания, что ли. Поэтому эта как бы критика выступает еще более левой, чем само левое, в таком классическом догматическом смысле этого дискурс. Но это как бы вот отвечает на ваш вопрос, в частности. И на мой взгляд, это просто надо понять, чтобы не попадать в какие-то глупые ситуации, что здесь есть какое-то примирение с реальностью. Здесь нет никакого примирения с реальностью. Здесь есть отказ от отождествления реальности и какой-то сказки о нем, да, который, например, да, какого-то рассказа о нем, одного и навсегда записанного где-то. Марксом, там, неважно кем, да.
Я думаю, что у нас время уже последнего вопроса, да, потому что очень затягиваем, может быть.
I think I was wrong. It's just my mobile phone says 10 o'clock, but it's 9.
Okay, but we still
Yeah,
have
because
one question.
yeah, I got it wrong.
У меня общий вопрос по спекулятивному реализму, может, немножко наивный. То есть спекулятивный реализм, он направлен против креационизма, то есть его основной тезис. И креационизм для спекулятивного реализма, он выступает в качестве такого догматического момента. Да? То есть он ведет к различным мифологизациям, связанным с тем, что любой субъект, говорящий, может сказать, что все, что он говорит, истина, поскольку он говорит, это он. То есть апеллирует к своему сознанию. С другой стороны, он противопоставляет этому тезис, связанный, в частности, Миасу, связанный с математикой, с наукой. Да? То есть он все время, у него аргументация апеллирует к архиископаемому, которая фиксирует с помощью углеродного анализа, он в статье говорит, к математическому аппарату. Нет ли здесь чего-то в спекулятивном реализме от утопии классического естествознания Лейбница и Декарта, которая провозглашала науку как абсолютным критерием теоретическим, с помощью которого можно познать мир такой, как он есть? Спасибо.
Спасибо.
I also want to answer to Igor's several questions, but I would partly agree that there is a kind of how do you say an utopian element in Meyasu, but there's definitely this idea of going back. That's why he's focused on Hume and other philosophers going back to this 18th century or 17th century, 18th century philosophers, Hume and Descartes, you know. And you might call this utopian, but I just want to remind you, I'm not here to defend like Meyasu now, but there is a political reason, you know. If you read After Finitude, then you see that his whole point, that behind his philosophical argumentation, there's a political point, namely the rise of irrationalism. You know? And his claim is that by following Kant and by following this kind of reasons got to stay within its safe critical boundaries, philosophy gave away huge of terror to religion. To all kinds of esoteric, irrational kind of thinking or tendencies, and we gotta conquer this back, you know. So this is related to the question of future, because I'm sure you have similar tendencies here in Russia too. There is a way of, instead of looking towards the future, our politics looks back into the past, you know, and takes whatever examples or whatever kind of historical imagery or ideologies there are, as a kind of structuring of the present. And that's, of course, in my understanding, of course, the wrong way around. So it's within that context you have to understand this utopian element of Meyasu. We have to, there is no looking backward, we have to go forward. As Nick says somewhere in the film. Now, I just want to say that why I share the kind of enthusiasm as a kind of, I have to share it, so that there is, whether I have my doubts or not, that's the only way we can look towards. Then there were two things that you said, Igor, and one was about this text and the icon, and then the question of criticism and the left being part of our neoliberal capitalism. The first part about the text and the icon, that's why I handed out the book so people can have a look. This goes also in relation with what Anastasia asked. I hate the art world, but I love artists, and I love to work with them. But working with them is really every time, doing the film or so, it's a project that goes 6 months or 2 years, and then something comes out of it, and it totally transforms how I think, because I learn how they think by what they do, but not by writing about someone's paintings, or normally the relation or the encounter between art and philosophy is philosophers have no idea about art, and artists have no idea about philosophy, and then it comes to catalog texts that are good for galleries to sell paintings. But there's no thinking, so it's very unsatisfying, I think, for and it's very academic as well. That goes for the most part of art history as well, or art theory. There's nothing happening, and I think most philosophy and most art is very boring. And when they go together, it's even worse. So that's why I'm really encouraging experimental ways of encounter. And now to the second part, yes, I think that's why many people in the left understand accelerationism as conservative or utopian or a new kind of futurism or kind of dromo nihilism or fetishizing speed and so on. I think the problem of the established left is that they do not see how far they are part of not just the system. It's not about individual people walking through, like marching through the institutions and now being part of the system, but it's the logic of our neoliberal capitalism that has been invented by not artists, but somehow by artists. Now, if you know, who of you knows this famous study by Boltanski-Chiapello on the third spirit of capitalism? So what Boltanski-Chiapello showed. Boltanski-Chiapello, yeah. So what they show is that our whole what initially some strange romantics, Baudelaire and so on, came up with, namely an image or an understanding of the individual, of the subject as original, as flexible, as inventive, as and so on, has with 68 in the West has become like widespread. And so it's now valid for the whole of our society. So we do no longer live in a kind of inhibitative or restraining or censoring capitalism, but we live in a capitalism that exploits us exactly by means of aesthetics and criticism. We have to be original, we have to reinvent ourselves, we have to be flexible, we have to, and so on, all the time, otherwise we drown, We have all these liberties, be free, bring yourself in 24/7, mobile phone is all the time on, and so on. So it is the triumph of 68, and it is the triumph of aesthetics and a certain artistic. That's why they speak about an aesthetic spirit, artistic spirit of critique of this capitalism. So we live in the triumph of contemporary art and criticism, which is our contemporary neoliberal capitalism. So having more of it and then showing like critical artworks in a gallery criticizing this is just like not going to work, because it's just the same, more of the same. So hence I see and this also relates to what I said before, hence the fundamental attack, I think, of speculative realism to contemporary art, if it's taken seriously. But again, it's in the making. The reason why I did this accelerationist book, this is an anecdote I often tell, is because I got so annoyed. In the film, you saw like one book presentation, Proquem bookstore, it's a famous bookstore in Berlin. And like 6 months before, I did another book presentation, or 1 year before, I did another book presentation on speculative realism. And my friends, my lefty critical friends were there, and all they had to say was, oh, these are just men, oh, this is so apolitical, oh, they want to do like ontology instead of like gender criticism and so on. And I got really like angry because I knew that all these speculative realists are very political, but like they do it in a different way. So I went drinking afterwards with the boss of Merve, and I said, like, you know what, we're going to give them a book on accelerationism. He said, what was that? It's another one of your weird ideas. And I said, like, okay, let me, you drive home, and in the 20 minutes while you're driving home, I send you 6 articles. I mean, there were not more than 6 at the time, And I said, this is what we translate, and we make it accelerationism, right? And now, acceleration is like, it's working, because many people identify with some of the claims of this like hashtag accelerationism, and it becomes a kind of reality. I hope this makes you see a bit like why I'm interested in hyperstitions. You can, you got to make things, and not just complain. So speculative poetics is about poesis. It's about doing, not criticizing. I'm not criticizing the artwork. I just do something different. I'm not criticizing our academy. I'm just doing the better philosophy, and so on. Just like do something different.
Thank you, Armen. We have last question. Last question.
First of all, I wanted to thank you for this marvelous and inspiring screening. And I have a rather quick question, and I wanted to ask you, not necessarily as a theorist, but probably as a as you said, publishing activists and enthusiasts who is concerned with spreading ideas. And well, I cut to the chase. What do you think will be the modes of distribution and circulation of philosophy in the coming years? I ask this because when we speak about current philosophy and philosophy whose many
philosophy analytic,
like current philosophy, current philosophical developments. Yeah, many thinkers who represent these recent developments in philosophy. Some of them are featured in your documentary. Yeah, they often work on the fringes of academia, and they practice the philosophy in unconventional ways, be it blogging, filmmaking, and also theoretical fiction, which is the case of Reznik, Aristani, and whatnot. Yeah, I can continue. And do you think that there is any chance of re-territorialization, academical re-territorialization, to put it in the parlance, of these new, unheard of ways of practicing philosophy? Thank you.
Thank you. But did I understand correctly that you want, you're looking for re-territorialization? You would like that?
No. I wouldn't say
because
that.
That would be a kind of re-academization. So all of these guys should get a job and then become boring academic philosophers.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I'm asked because what interests me is your take on this process if it happens. And would philosophy gain something if it is re-academized or not? That's like.
I mean, I don't think that there is such a thing as the philosophy. The reason why I say in this film the most important philosopher of the 21st century is Robert McKay is because he created a platform for the things happening. He organized this conference, he invented Reza Negasani, and so on, you know? And it changed how we think about philosophy. We do no longer think that, okay, a philosopher gotta be, as I said, 80 years old and have published 10 books, you know? It's enough to publish one manifesto online, and 3 months later it's in 17 languages or in 25 languages. And the people are postdocs or like still writing their PhD, and it can become like much more important than all these like established philosophers. So there is no such thing as the philosophy, you know. I'm interested in this de-territorialization, and I think any kind of re-territorialization, to use your term, just is going to fail because we live we're witnessing a kind of massive like revolution of our culture, namely the digital revolution. You know, I mean, if you say like humanity went through like a few revolutions. Like one is the invention of language, and when we became like stopped being nomads, or high cultures when we learned like writing, or modernity with printing. And the same thing is happening just right now, and we have no idea where it's going to lead. The digital revolution has just started, and I don't see anywhere any understanding of how to deal with it, and especially not in the academy or with philosophers. You know, they still do philosophy as if we are like riding on horses, or maybe driving in cars, but like we are far beyond. And so that interesting things are happening in blogs, in films, and so on, is a matter of fact. But the criticism I often get is, oh, this is just a hype, you know, it's just some people blogging. It's not proper philosophy because it's not done by tenured philosophers in Berlin or Munich or Düsseldorf, you know. But I don't care, so I try to learn from this, and that's why I did, for example, a film on hyperstition, because I want to understand what it means to think via hypes. And in hype and hyperstition in the 21st century means something else. But again, I can't do it in practice. I cannot tell you without doing it. I have to try it out, and then I will know. You know, so we have to do it. We have to practice it, and then we will know whether 21st century philosophy is hyperstitional, because our 21st century, digital, post-digital century, the way information like is distributed or is produced is working in a hyperstitional way. And if that's the case, then also theory that becomes real, you know, has to be hyperstitional. And what does it mean? Like, I'm trying to experiment with it by doing things like this, or doing this kind of publishing activism. So I don't have an answer. I can just describe you my practice.
So should we
find out?
Should we just say that you're in favor of new ways of practicing philosophy, like blogging, writing manifestos, filmmaking, and what, like?
I mean, all I can say is I'm not in favor with 19th century, 20th century, or 16th century Gutenberg galaxy ways of doing philosophy, because it's not going to exist in 30 years anyhow. It's like, you believe, are you in favor of a newspaper printed being in crisis? Well, whether I'm in favor or not, they're going to die anyhow. So
They don't
like,
stand any chance?
What?
So they don't stand.
Many things we're happy with, like people were complaining for hundreds of years, you know. I mean, I don't see the problem. The question is like, we have to embrace it and learn from it, so that it's us, the good ones, I would say, you know, that are like shaping it and directing it, and not the evil ones, or those that are just out for profit. You know, and the more we embrace it, the higher the chances that we can influence it. But the critical practice so far has really been, this is dirty money, this is dirty economy, this is I don't know what, we stay outside of it, you know? And the more a contemporary artist, to go back to your question, thinks he's not part of the art market, the more he is part of the art market, because the less he can influence it, the less power he has. And the same goes with like, publishing or thinking, you know. There is no thinking at home at my desk independent of hyperstition, the stock market, and films and blogs. It just, even if I lock myself in the countryside in Germany or in Siberia, I'm not. I can switch off my Facebook, but I'm not out of these circuits. So the only way is to go in, you know, and accelerate it. But not in the sense of like more speed, but like, you know, using the positive dynamic.
Thank you very much. I think we finished for tonight. It was very intense. Thank you, Armena.